What's up, everybody? Mr. Forrest back with another episode of E3 Squared. Ed Encounters Ezekiel. Guys, I hope you've been with us for this ride all summer long. It's been incredible. Buckle up because we have a very special E3 Squared today. Let's jump right into it. Mike Ferguson had been pretty arrogant lately. Arrogant is when you think you're big stuff. It's also called pride or having a big ego. And Mike thought he was hot stuff. Mike was the best football player in the school, and some people said for his age he was the best football player in the state. Mike was the biggest and strongest kid in school, and because he was the biggest and strongest kid, no one ever really messed with him. One time, someone actually tried to mess with him, and Mike beat that kid up, gave him a wedgie, and then stuffed him in the garbage can. Because Mike was always a superstar in sports, so many people always gave him free stuff. Coaches who wanted him to come play at their football camp would give him free shoes and give him free sports apparel. Trainers were always giving him free KT tape, and schools that wanted him to come and play for their private school would offer him scholarships for his tuition. Kids in his school were always doing his homework for him and letting him copy off of their tests. Some teachers even gave Mike better grades than he deserved. Everybody knew him at school, and he was super popular, and all the boys wanted to be like him, and all the girls thought of him as a great big teddy bear, and he got at least 10 hugs every day. Mike wasn't just big stuff in his school. Everyone in the community knew him, and kids from other schools talked about him constantly. Some people would even say it this way: Mike was a football god. Because Mike got all this attention and because he was so big and so strong, Mike was puffed up with pride. He would spend so much time in front of the mirror every single day, flexing. He would treat people like they were his servants. He lived his life as if it was always all about him. It was getting pretty obnoxious, and Steve and Ed noticed, and they planned on having a talk with him about it, and everything came to a head one day at the 7-Eleven. One of the great things about 7-Eleven is that you can choose what kind of Big Bite you want, and you can build your own Big Bite. A Big Bite is a hot dog, and there are several different kinds of hot dogs at 7-Eleven. Steve always liked getting the bacon cheeseburger Big Bite. Ed always liked getting the spicy bite. Mike always liked getting the Bahama Mama. And there's this condiment bar where you can put whatever you want on it. And Steve would always put chili and cheese on his bacon cheeseburger Big Bite. And Mike would always put ketchup and mustard on his Bahama Mama. And Ed would always put 47 jalapenos along with wasabi peas, grape jelly, and gummy bears on his spicy bite. The guy who was ringing them up was gagging the whole time. He's like... As they were paying, Ed said, "Guys, put your wallets away. This one's on me." And Mike's eyes got really wide, and he ran back to the Big Bites, and he got 5 more Bahama Mamas. The boys filled up their Slurpee cups, and they headed outside, and they sat down, and they were eating their Big Bites. And Mike took the first bite of his Bahama Mama, and he looked up, and he said, "I love Big Bites." But suddenly, Ed got that familiar, faraway look in his eyes. And Steve and Mike looked at each other and went, uh-oh. Ed was having one of those focused, unfocused moments where his mind was razor sharp, but it couldn't focus on one thing at a time, so it jumped from one thing to the next. And Ed stood up and said, "Big Bites, Big Bites, Big Bites, Big Ben. Yeah, Big Ben." Big Ben is a giant clock tower in London that Ed had always wanted to visit. So Ed jumped upside down and did a handstand. And then he used his legs as if they were the hands of the clock. His left leg, which was shorter than his right leg, was the hour hand of the clock, and his right leg, which was longer than his left leg, was the minute hand of the clock. And Ed had this unusually long tongue, and his tongue was the second hand of the clock. And Ed kept perfect time in fast motion, and when his legs had done one complete 360 rotation, which very few people are that flexible in the entire world, but Ed could pull it off. Ed went bing bong, bing bong, bing bong, bing bong, and then he gonged 12 times, and kids walking by were giving him sideways glances like, who is this strangely flexible kid acting like he was a clock? Steve and Mike were a little more than embarrassed, but Ed continued. Big bite, Big Ben, big boot. Yeah, big boot. The big boot was the finishing move of Ed's favorite professional wrestler, Handlebar Mustache Man. Handlebar Mustache Man was the world's heavyweight champion. And the way he would finish his opponents is he would whip them off the ropes, and as they came running back toward them, he'd lift up his size 16 boot and catch them square in the jaw and knock them silly, and then he would pin them for the 3 count. And Ed was trying to perform the big boot on Mike, so he grabbed Mike as if to throw him off the side of the building, but Mike didn't even budge. He just kept eating his Bahama Mama. Ed went to grab Steve, but Steve jumped to his feet and ran away. Ed looked around and he saw his Slurpee cup on the ground, and he picked up his Slurpee cup and he threw it off the side of the building. It bounced off the side of the building. Ed lifted up his foot and he gave his Slurpee cup the big boot, which sent him crashing back into the side of the building. The lid flew off of the cup and drenched Ed in Slurpee. His hair was yellow. He smelled like melon mango madness. But his mind kept going. Big bites, Big Ben, big boot, big bird. Yeah, Big Bird. Big Bird was Ed's favorite character on a popular television show, and Ed admired Big Bird so much because Big Bird was 6'5" and a talking bird. And Ed always wondered, how did that bird grow to be 6'5"? And who taught that bird how to talk? Ed already was yellow because of the Slurpee, so it was perfect. And he ran to the garbage can and he dug around and he found 2 empty chicken buckets, and using his shoelaces he tied them to his feet, so now he was standing on the chicken buckets like they were miniature stilts, and now he was nice and tall. And he ran around saying, "Now that's cooperation. That's cooperation." He ran back into the 7-Eleven where a group of kids were playing Miss Pac-Man, and Ed stuck his face right in front of the Miss Pac-Man screen and said, "Now that's cooperation." Ed ran outside while all the kids looked over and saw this yellow kid who smelled like melon walking on chicken buckets run out the door. Ed ran up to an old man who was smoking in the parking lot and he said, "Now that's cooperation." Ed ran to the bus stop where 2 people were about to get in a fight because one of them had put their already chewed gum on the bus stop bench and the other one sat on it and it was stuck and smeared all over that person's jeans. And Ed ran up to the people who were about to fist fight and said, "Now that's cooperation." And he ran back to Steve and Ed and said, "Now that's cooperation." And then he continued. Big bites, Big Ben, big boot, big bird, big band. Yeah, big band. Big band was a musical style of jazz from the early 1900s to almost the mid-1900s. Ed had always dreamed about living in the 1930s and playing in a big band. Again, Ed ran over to the garbage can and rummaged around until he found a half-eaten taquito. He looked around on the ground and he found a couple pennies and a dime. He saw his Slurpee straw that had been on the ground from his big boot, and he crammed all those together and he made a makeshift clarinet out of garbage, and he yelled, "I'm Benny Goodman!" And he started playing the song Sing, Sing, Sing on his garbage clarinet and dancing swing style. Now, nobody around him who was staring at him at the moment knew who Benny Goodman was, but they were surprised at how proficiently this kid could play the garbage clarinet. Ed continued. Big bite, Big Ben, big. Mike said, whoa, 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 Ed. Why don't you just sit down next to me and we'll eat our big bites and we'll talk, just talk. Ed said, that's a good idea, Mike. There's something I've been meaning to talk to you about. Mike said, good. Sit down and talk. Talk is good. Focus, unfocus is bad. And their conversation turned toward the gospel. Steve and Ed talked to Mike about how we are all sinners. And because we're sinners, we are separated from God. That's why we need God to save us from our sins and bring us back into a relationship with Him, who's our creator and who loves us so much. Mike said, guys, I don't really need that stuff. God is a crutch for weak people. I'm not weak. I'm Mike, like the Mike. I'm not weak. I'm a boss. I don't need a crutch of any kind. I'm invincible. I don't need God. Ed said, Mike, you sound like the king of Tyre. Mike said, the king of what? Ed said, the king of Tyre. The king of Tyre was an ancient coastal city between the mountains of Lebanon and the Mediterranean Sea. It was the most important city in Phoenicia because of its location for trade. They would trade with people from all over the world, and it made them super duper rich. And there were two parts of the city. One was the coastal part of the city, that the city was along the coast, and the other was the island part of the city. It was actually on a rock island less than a mile offshore. And it was a fortress with huge walls. It was heavily fortified. And because it was completely surrounded with water, it was nearly impossible to attack. If anyone tried to attack it on boats, the people in the island fortress would stand on the walls and rain flaming arrows at the ships. The flaming arrows would stick into the ships and light them on fire, and everybody inside would have to abandon the ship and jump overboard, and the ships would be lost and people would die. They seemed invincible. Tyre was called the Queen of the Sea, and the word Tyre itself means rock because of their strength, because of their invincibility, because they were built on a rock. And because they were so mighty, and because they seemed invincible, they became proud and arrogant. They thought they were the most beautiful city in the world, the strongest city in the world, the richest city in the world. Tyre was so arrogant and so proud that Tyre's king, Ethbaal II, actually says in Ezekiel 28, I am a god. I make my throne in the council of the gods, in the middle of the sea. In his mind, he didn't need God because he was a god. But Yahweh had something to say about that. In Ezekiel 26 and 27, Ezekiel sings a funeral dirge for Tyre. Mike said, what's a funeral dirge? Ed said, it is a funeral song. And here's the catch. Ezekiel sang this funeral song while Tyre was still prospering. Mike said, that doesn't make sense. Shouldn't you sing a funeral song at the funeral after the person was dead? Ed said, yeah, that's the funny part. It would be like somebody walking up to a birthday party, crashing the birthday party, wearing a black suit with a black tie, coming in with a preacher that he hired and a funeral home director and some pallbearers carrying a casket. And the person who crashes the party walks up and says, he was a good man. He loved others. He didn't cheat on his taxes. He gave out bacon freely. He will be missed. And everybody's playing the piñata and they stop and they look over at this strange person wondering, why is he doing this at a birthday party? It would thoroughly confuse people. But in this passage, Ezekiel is not confused. What he is saying is that you are as good as dead. So I'm going to go ahead and sing your funeral song now. And Ezekiel says this in the prophecy in chapter 26. He says, Nebuchadnezzar is going to come. Now remember, there are two parts to the city, the mainland city and the island city. He said Nebuchadnezzar is going to come and he's going to destroy the mainland city. And then the nations are going to come and they're going to destroy the island city. And then in chapter 27, Ezekiel starts singing his song. And Ezekiel says, Tyre, you're like a big ship. Now bear with me as Ezekiel describes what kind of ship this is. He says, you're like a big, beautiful ship built from the cedars of Lebanon, the most famous wood at that time in the world. Ezekiel said, the ship's oars are made from the oaks of Bashan, and the deck is made of cypress, inlaid with ivory. The sails were made from the woven linen from Egypt. The deck's awning was blue and purple from Elisha. The oarsmen were from Sidon and Arvad and were big and strong and could row. The skilled seamen were from Tyre. And the veteran craftsmen were from Gabal, so if there were any cracks, they could immediately repair it. They hired mercenaries from all over the world who were excellent fighters and covered the decks with their shields for protection. And nations came from all over the world to trade with this big, beautiful merchant ship. So Ezekiel says, you, Tyre, you're like this big, beautiful, ornate, rich, powerful, protected merchant ship. You are the greatest in the world. Could there possibly be a more perfect ship? And then Ed said it's kind of like the Titanic. He said, Mike, have you ever heard of the Titanic of 1912? And Mike said, well, yeah. Ed said it was the largest passenger steamship in the world. It could hold 3,500 people with the latest technological advances for its time. It had a gymnasium. It had a swimming pool. It had 2 libraries. The rooms were beautiful and elegant. The ship was big and it was powerful and it was described as unsinkable. In fact, the ship's captain said, even God himself can't sink this ship. But on a Sunday night, the captain received warnings of icebergs. The Titanic hit an iceberg and then sank to the bottom of the ocean. Ed said, Mike, this ship that Tyre is compared to is like the Titanic. It was big, beautiful, strong, unsinkable. But then it got so heavy with cargo, silver and bronze, ivory and ebony, wine and horses. It became so heavy it started to sink and then crack and break and fall apart. And the powerful oarsmen tried to get them to safety, but the east winds were too strong. The boat broke up and everything and everyone in it sank to the bottom of the ocean. All the people aboard died. And all the people who were watching from the mainland were crying and mourning because of all the stuff that was lost and all the people who were lost. People shaved their heads and sprinkled ashes and dust on their heads. They wore sackcloth and they sang funeral songs. And notice what Yahweh says in the last verse of chapter 27. The merchants among the peoples hiss at you. You have come to a dreadful end and shall be no more forever. Mike got the chills, and it wasn't from his Slurpee. To be honest, this was haunting. It kind of scared Mike. Ed went on and he said, Mike, God was saying to Tyre, you're like this big, beautiful, invincible ship that sank to the bottom of the ocean and was destroyed because I'm going to destroy you. Then, just like Yahweh said, Nebuchadnezzar came and he demolished, decimated, destroyed the mainland city of Tyre. But remember, just like there were 2 parts to the city, there were 2 prophecies about the city. Nebuchadnezzar, in fact, tried to destroy the island city of Tyre, but he couldn't. Their walls were too strong. His navy was not powerful enough. So he had to settle on just collecting tribute or money from them on a regular basis. This probably made them even more proud because Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful man in the world. And if Nebuchadnezzar couldn't conquer them, who was going to conquer them? But then a couple hundred years later, a young man came and conquered the world before he turned 30. And it is said when he conquered his final nation, he sat down and cried because there were no more nations to conquer. And his name was Alexander the Great. And as Alexander the Great swept through the world conquering, he came to the island city of Tyre, the fortress of Tyre. And the island fortress of Tyre said, "Nah, you can't get us. Not even Nebuchadnezzar could get us because we are invincible." And Alexander the Great said, "Oh yeah?" And he took the rubble from the destruction of mainland Tyre, that now deserted city, and he threw the rubble with his army into the Mediterranean Sea. And he built a bridge or a causeway out to the island. And he built 2 huge 150-foot tall towers. These were movable towers. They were siege weapons. On top of each of the towers, he had a catapult to launch things and clear out the defenders who were on top of the walls shooting flaming arrows. Underneath, he had ballista to hurl rocks at ships that would try to attack them from the sides. He had covered those huge towers in wet animal skins so that if any of the flaming arrows did hit it, it would not catch it on fire. Alexander the Great used his huge navy of 223 ships to attack, and he turned some of the ships into battering rams so they would sail full force into the walls to attack the walls and break the walls, and they breached the city and they killed thousands of people and they carried thousands more into captivity. He completely and totally decimated that island fortress and scraped it clean exactly how Yahweh said it would happen. He said he'd scrape it clean like a bald rock. And look at the last verse in chapter 26. "I will bring you to a dreadful end, and you shall be no more. Though you should be sought for, you will never be found again, declares Yahweh God." And just like Yahweh said, this seemingly invincible city, this rock fortress island, was scraped clean. And this king who said, "I am a god," was proven to be just a man. And when he said, "I make my throne in the midst of the sea," his throne became his grave. And the undertones of this passage are that that city sank down and down and down to the bottom of the sea. But it kept sinking. Down and down and down to the realm of the dead ones. Once again, Mike got the chills, and Ed said, "Mike, even the most powerful person in the world is puny compared to God. Even the richest person in the world is in poverty compared to God. No one is invincible. Everyone can be brought down. Mike, you are actually right that God is for the weak, but the truth is we are all weak. Therefore, we all need God." Ed said, "Mike, don't wait till God shows you how weak you are. Turn to him now. Admit that you are weak. Admit you need him to save you from your sins." Mike never told anybody this. But Mike actually had a heart condition. And it was serious. And it could actually take his life. But he didn't tell anybody this because he always wanted to seem like a boss. He always wanted to seem invincible. He liked it when people called him a football god. He liked being the most popular kid in school, and he did not want to be seen as weak. So he stood up and stuck his chest out and he said, "Boys, thanks for the talk, but I'm a boss. I'm Mike Ferguson. I'm invincible. I'm not weak. I gotta get to practice. I'll see you guys later." And even though Steve and Ed didn't know about Mike's heart condition, they prayed for him then and there. They prayed that their friend Mike would turn from his sin and turn to Jesus. Now something would happen to Mike's heart. Something tragic. Something scary. but you have to wait till next week to find out. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of E3 Squared. Did you know the Bible teaches that pride goes before destruction? Did you know that the Bible teaches that God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble? Pride is often what keeps people from coming to Christ. They think they have it all together. They think they're fine. They think they're in control and they got it handled. But the truth is we are all weak. The truth is we all need God. And the most important way we need God is we need Him to save us from our sins and the judgment that sin brings. Like we saw last week, God certainly judges sin. If you've never repented and believed on Jesus, don't let pride keep you from doing so. Repent and believe on Jesus now. If you are a believer, you have repented and believed on Jesus, then pride has no place in the life of a believer because everything that we have has been given to us as a gift from God. So we can't take credit for it. We can only be thankful for it. This week's memory verse is Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. So for the first time this week, our memory verse is not from the book of Ezekiel, but it is very appropriate from what we learned this week in the book of Ezekiel. Don't forget, say your verse, do your questions, have your parents email me, get them to me, and we'll send you guys the prize. Or if you're local, you can drive through and pick up your prize Friday at 3. Everyone who does their verse and their questions and reading will be entered into the epic prize drawing, which we will pull Sunday night live right here on my channel at 6 p.m. Hope to see you guys then, but until then, Mr. Forrest, out.